My father stood in the middle of his garage, holding a faded department store receipt with both hands. For several long seconds, he didn't move. Then he looked inside the dusty cardboard box at his feet and pulled out another receipt. And another. By the time he reached the bottom, there were 12 of them spread across the workbench, each folded neatly around a matching birthday gift receipt, each bearing his own signature, and each dated 1 year apart. Watches, books, a silver necklace, concert tickets, a college graduation fountain pen. Gifts he clearly remembered buying, gifts I had never received. Then he picked up one final receipt that looked different from all the others. Across the bottom, stamped in bold red ink, was a single word: returned. He stared at it before slowly whispering to himself, if she returned this one, then what happened to all the others? If you've ever spent years believing someone you loved simply didn't care enough to remember you, you probably know how easily children create explanations when adults don't provide any. We tell ourselves Dad must have been too busy. Maybe work mattered more. Maybe birthdays just weren't important in our family. Eventually, those explanations stop feeling temporary and become part of who we think we are. By the time I reached adulthood, I genuinely believed my father had forgotten almost every birthday after he remarried. I didn't resent him anymore, because resentment requires expecting something different. Instead, I quietly accepted that I simply wasn't the child people remembered buying presents for. Looking back now, I realize the saddest lies aren't always the ones someone tells you directly. Sometimes they're the ones you repeat to yourself for so many years that they begin sounding like memories. My name is Megan Carter. I was 30 years old when my father discovered that dusty cardboard box in the garage, though neither of us knew at the time that it would completely change how we remembered the previous 20 years. I worked as a pediatric speech-language pathologist outside Chicago, helping children find confidence in voices they were often afraid to use. My husband, Ethan, joked that I had endless patience with everyone except slow internet connections. And together we were raising our 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, who believed every birthday deserved balloons, whether someone turned 6 or 60. From the outside, my life looked wonderfully ordinary. I loved my work, adored my family, and had finally reached a place where I no longer expected my father to become the kind of parent I imagined after my mother passed away. That acceptance brought a certain peace, even if it also carried a quiet sadness I rarely admitted out loud. Everything changed 1 week earlier during my 30th birthday dinner. Dad insisted on hosting the celebration himself, saying he'd already missed too many family evenings because of business trips over the years. The dinner started exactly the way I hoped it would. Ethan grilled steaks in the backyard, while Sophie proudly arranged birthday candles that leaned at impossible angles. Dad disappeared into his study shortly before dessert and returned carrying a small velvet box wrapped in silver paper. He smiled with the nervous excitement fathers sometimes have when they're secretly hoping they chose the right gift. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, placing the package in front of me. "I've actually been planning this one for months." Before I could untie the ribbon, my stepmother Linda laughed softly from across the table. "Richard," she said with an amused smile, "you really don't have to pretend anymore. Megan already knows you were never the one who remembered her birthdays." The room fell completely silent. Dad looked at Linda as though she'd suddenly started speaking another language. "What do you mean?" he asked. She shrugged casually before taking another sip of wine. "Come on. Half the time you forgot until I reminded you. Some years you didn't buy anything at all." Then she turned toward me with the same sympathetic smile she'd worn for most of my childhood. "Isn't that right, Megan? You used to wait all day hoping your dad would remember." I didn't answer immediately, because the painful part was that I believed she was telling the truth. I remembered birthdays ending without presents. I remembered Dad apologizing for being busy. I remembered convincing myself that business trips mattered more than cakes or wrapped boxes. Finally, I nodded. "It's okay," I said quietly. "That was a long time ago." Dad never took his eyes off Linda. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think it was." The conversation moved on, but Dad barely spoke for the rest of the evening. Every so often, I'd catch him looking toward me with the same puzzled expression he'd worn after Linda's comment, as though he were searching through memories that no longer fit together properly. The following morning, while cleaning the garage for the first time in years, he found an old cardboard box tucked behind several containers of Christmas decorations. Across the top, written in his own handwriting, were 4 words he had absolutely no memory of writing: "Megan's birthday receipts." Though, and inside, was the first piece of evidence that my father had never forgotten a single birthday. Then Dad rarely called me before 9 in the morning, especially on weekdays when he knew I would already be at the rehabilitation center working with patients. So when my phone lit up at 8:17 the following Tuesday with his name on the screen, I immediately assumed something had happened to Linda. Instead, the moment I answered, I heard something far more unsettling. Dad sounded confused, not frightened, not angry, just confused in a way I had never heard before. "Megan," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer without worrying about hurting my feelings." I stepped into an empty therapy room and closed the door behind me. "Of course." There was a long pause before he asked, "Do you remember the watch I bought you for your 16th birthday?" I smiled sadly. "Dad, you didn't buy me a watch." Another silence followed, longer this time. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "That's impossible." When I arrived at his house that evening, the cardboard box still sat open on the workbench exactly where he had found it. Every receipt had been arranged carefully across the table in chronological order. Dad had even written the years on small sticky notes beside each one, trying to build a timeline that made sense. The first receipt was dated 2 weeks before my 10th birthday, less than a year after he married Linda. It showed the purchase of a children's bicycle in my favorite color, lavender. I stared at it for several seconds before looking back at Dad. "I never had a purple bike." He nodded slowly. "I know." He picked up the matching receipt, unfolded it, and showed me something written across the bottom in his own handwriting. "For my brave girl. Love, Dad." My throat tightened immediately. I had spent years believing my father stopped writing birthday cards after my mother died. Apparently he hadn't. I had simply never seen them. One by one, we opened the envelopes that had somehow remained sealed for nearly 2 decades. There was a receipt for a telescope because I had once told Dad I wanted to learn the names of the stars. Another showed a beginner's guitar after I begged for music lessons in middle school. There was a silver charm bracelet for my 18th birthday, engraved with my initials, and a leather-bound journal he had chosen when I started college because, according to the receipt, the salesman told him, "Good writers deserve good paper." Every purchase matched a dream I remembered having at that age. Every gift reflected conversations only Dad and I had shared. The more receipts we read, the less they looked like random shopping records. They looked like proof that someone had been paying close attention to the little details of my life all along. I found myself crying over pieces of paper because they described birthdays that, in my memory, had ended with quiet disappointment. "I don't understand," I admitted, wiping my eyes. "If you bought all these things, where did they go?" Dad leaned against the workbench and rubbed both hands across his face. "That's the question I've been asking myself since yesterday." He walked toward an old filing cabinet in the corner of the garage and returned carrying several faded photo albums. "I thought maybe I'd remember giving them to you." We flipped through birthday photographs year after year. In every picture, I smiled politely beside a cake. Linda stood next to Dad. Friends came and went. Balloons decorated the dining room. But something immediately stood out once we started looking closely. There were never any wrapped presents. Not one gift bag. Not one ribbon. Not even torn wrapping paper on the floor. It was as though birthdays in our house had quietly transformed into dinners where presents simply didn't exist. I had never questioned it because memories have a strange way of adapting to whatever story we've accepted as normal. Dad suddenly stopped turning pages. He stared at one photograph from my 16th birthday before sliding it across the table toward me. "Look at the date." I did. The picture had been taken on my birthday, exactly as expected. Then he placed the matching department store receipt beside it. According to the timestamp, he had purchased the watch only 3 hours before the party began. "I couldn't have forgotten," he said quietly. "I bought it that afternoon." We both looked back at the photograph. There I was, smiling beside my cake. Linda stood behind me with one hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Dad stood beside us, clapping while everyone sang happy birthday. Yet the beautifully wrapped gift described on the receipt was nowhere in sight. Not in the dining room, not on the table, not anywhere in the picture. It was as though it had vanished between the department store and our front door. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Dad reached into the bottom of the cardboard box and removed one last folded document he hadn't noticed the previous day because it had slipped beneath the receipts. It wasn't a store receipt this time. It was a customer return confirmation, printed exactly 6 days after my 16th birthday. Across the top appeared the same department store logo. Beneath it was the item description: women's silver watch. Under reason for return, someone had checked one small box. Gift not wanted. Dad slowly looked up from the paper. "I never returned it." Then he turned the receipt over. That was, on the back, was Linda's signature. The return receipt sat between us for nearly a full minute before either of us reached for it again. Dad turned it over several times, as though another explanation might somehow appear if he looked closely enough. Linda's signature was unmistakable. She had signed birthday cards, school permission slips, holiday checks, and Christmas presents for more than 20 years. There was no possibility that someone else had written her name. Yet neither of us wanted to say aloud what the receipt seemed to suggest. Finally, Dad broke the silence. "There has to be a reason." His voice carried more hope than certainty. "Maybe the watch was damaged. Maybe they ordered another one." I nodded because I wanted to believe that too. One receipt alone couldn't explain 12 birthdays. One mistake couldn't erase an entire childhood. But somewhere deep inside, a question I had never allowed myself to ask quietly surfaced for the first time. What if the birthdays I remembered weren't actually the birthdays that happened? Dad spent the rest of the evening searching through every envelope inside the cardboard box. Each receipt had been folded with unusual care, and many still contained the small handwritten gift notes he always tucked inside presents. The notes weren't elaborate. They were exactly what I would have expected from my father. Simple, slightly awkward, and deeply sincere. Keep reaching for the stars, sweetheart. I know you'll fill these pages with amazing stories. Never stop asking questions. Reading them felt strangely intimate because they weren't written for anyone else's eyes. They had been meant for me. I wondered how many birthdays Dad had stood in a department store, carefully choosing gifts while imagining the smile he expected to see on my face. Somehow those moments had existed without ever becoming part of my life. Instead of remembering thoughtful presents, I remembered Linda gently explaining that Dad's business trip had run late, or that he planned to celebrate the following weekend. Looking back, I realized those explanations always sounded reasonable because they were designed to. When we reached the receipts from my college years, another pattern began to emerge. Dad wasn't simply buying random presents each year. He was paying attention to conversations I barely remembered having. During my freshman year, I had mentioned wanting a digital voice recorder because recording therapy sessions would help me study speech patterns more effectively. The next birthday receipt listed that exact model. The following year, after I told him I loved an antique bookstore near campus, he purchased a first edition collection of children's poetry by my favorite author. There was even a receipt for a handmade quilt after I casually mentioned my apartment felt too empty during my first winter away from home. Every gift reflected something deeply personal, something I'd probably mentioned only once in passing. Dad noticed all of it. The realization hurt more than I expected, because it completely overturned the story I'd spent 20 years telling myself. He hadn't stopped paying attention after remarrying. Somehow, the evidence suggested he'd been paying even closer attention than I ever knew. I need to know whether this happened once or every year, Dad said quietly. Before I could answer, he picked up his phone and searched for the customer service number printed across the top of one of the receipts. I doubted anyone would still have records from nearly 2 decades earlier, but he called anyway. After explaining the situation to several different departments, he finally reached someone in corporate archives willing to help. The woman on the phone couldn't promise anything immediately, but she explained that older transactions connected to warranty registrations and loyalty accounts were sometimes preserved much longer than ordinary purchase records. She asked Dad to email copies of the receipts along with the return confirmation. If those items were returned using the original account, she said, there may still be a transaction history attached. Dad thanked her before hanging up, and for the first time that evening, I saw determination replace confusion. He wasn't searching for someone to blame anymore. He was searching for the truth, wherever it led. The following afternoon, while I was finishing paperwork at the rehabilitation center, Dad called again. This time, his voice sounded completely different. "They found something," he said immediately. I stepped into the same empty therapy room where we'd spoken the previous morning and closed the door behind me. According to the corporate archives department, the silver watch hadn't been the only returned item linked to his customer account. Over the next hour, an employee carefully compared serial numbers and purchase records from the receipts inside the box. By the end of the review, they confirmed that at least 9 of the 12 birthday gifts had been returned to different store locations over an 11-year period. Every return produced store credit or a refund. Every transaction required identification. Every receipt listed the same customer signature, Linda's. Dad stopped talking for several seconds before quietly adding, Megan. I don't think this was an accident. That evening, neither of us mentioned the investigation to Linda. Instead, Dad suggested something that surprised me. Before I confront anyone, he said, I want to know exactly what happened. He explained that accusations built on assumptions rarely healed families, even when those assumptions turned out to be true. If he was going to ask Linda impossible questions, he wanted impossible answers backed by facts. I admired that about him. Even after discovering evidence that would have made many people explode with anger, he still wanted certainty rather than revenge. As I prepared to leave, he carefully placed every receipt back inside the cardboard box before stopping at one envelope he hadn't opened yet. This one's different, he murmured. Unlike the others, the paper looked newer, and across the front someone had written only a date. It was my 12th birthday. I'm back. Dad slowly opened the envelope. And inside wasn't another receipt. Inside, it was a folded letter. I addressed Double Tune to him. Dad didn't open the letter immediately. He simply stared at my name written across the back of the envelope in my 12-year-old handwriting before carefully sliding a finger beneath the brittle seal. I remember this stationery, he said quietly. Your school sold these during the holiday fundraiser. I recognized it too. Tiny blue stars decorated the edges of the paper, and every fifth-grade student had received a small packet to write thank you notes or letters at home. I had completely forgotten about it until that moment. Whatever I'd written had somehow ended up inside the same box as the birthday receipts instead of reaching its intended destination. Dad unfolded the paper with extraordinary care, almost as though he feared the words themselves might break after waiting nearly 18 years to be read. Dear Dad, the letter began in shaky childhood handwriting. I know you're really busy now, so you don't have to feel bad about forgetting my birthday. Linda said grown-ups have more important things to remember than birthdays once kids get older. Dad stopped reading aloud. His jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment before continuing. I just wanted to tell you I got an A on my science project. I wish you could have seen it. Maybe next year we can celebrate together if you're not working. The final paragraph hit us both harder than anything we'd found so far. Please don't worry about buying me presents anymore. I know money is important, and I don't want to make things harder for you. I still love you even when you forget. The letter ended with a crooked little heart drawn beside my name. Dad lowered the page slowly onto the workbench. Neither of us spoke because there wasn't anything to say. A 12-year-old little girl had spent an entire birthday trying to comfort the father she believed had forgotten her. I never saw this, Dad whispered. He wasn't speaking to me anymore. He was speaking to himself. She told me you were angry with me. I looked up sharply. What? He rubbed his forehead as though trying to piece together memories that no longer fit. I remember asking Linda why you barely talked during dinner that year. She said you'd locked yourself in your room and didn't want to see me because I'd embarrassed you by missing your birthday. He looked back at the letter with disbelief. I knocked on your bedroom door that night. My own memory stirred uneasily. I remembered hearing footsteps in the hallway. I remembered Linda opening my bedroom door just enough to tell me Dad had already gone back to work because he felt guilty and didn't want to upset me further. I had accepted that explanation without question. Sitting there in the garage, we both realized something impossible. We weren't just uncovering missing gifts. We were uncovering missing conversations. That realization sent Dad searching through memories with renewed urgency. "Wait here," he said suddenly, before disappearing into the house. A few minutes later, he returned carrying an old desktop hard drive he had kept after replacing his office computer years earlier. "I used to save everything," he explained while connecting it to his laptop. "Emails, calendars, travel schedules." It took nearly half an hour before the outdated files finally loaded, but once they did, Dad searched the year of my 12th birthday. There, buried among client meetings and project deadlines, sat a calendar reminder created nearly 3 weeks before my birthday. "Leave office early. Megan's birthday. Pick up cake at 4:30. Dad closed his eyes. "I wasn't traveling," he said quietly. "I wasn't even working late." He clicked another file and found an email sent to his assistant requesting the afternoon off, specifically so he could attend my birthday dinner. Every record contradicted the version of events I had believed my entire life. We spent the next several hours comparing memories against evidence. Every time one of us remembered Linda's explanation for a missed birthday, another receipt, calendar entry, or note seemed to tell a different story. By evening, a disturbing pattern had become impossible to ignore. Linda had almost always been the person carrying information between us. If Dad called while I was at school, she answered. If I left him a note, she said she'd put it on his desk. If he bought presents, she insisted on wrapping them because she wanted birthdays to feel special. None of those things had seemed suspicious individually. Together, however, they formed something far more unsettling. She hadn't simply been organizing family life. She had quietly become the gatekeeper of our relationship. The following morning, Dad received another phone call from the department store's corporate archives. Emotionally. This time, the representative sounded almost embarrassed. "Mr. Carter," she began, "while reviewing the return transactions, one of our retired managers recognized your name." Dad put the call on speaker so I could hear. The woman explained that the manager had worked at the flagship location for more than 30 years and vividly remembered Linda because she frequently returned expensive gifts shortly after major holidays. According to him, she always used the same explanation. "My husband bought the wrong thing again." The manager apparently joked several times that Dad must have terrible taste in presents because Linda exchanged them so often. Then, the representative added something that made the room fall silent. "He also remembers asking once why your daughter wasn't with you." Mrs. Carter told him the gifts weren't for a child. She said they were anniversary presents. Dad slowly lowered the phone after the call ended. His face had become completely unreadable. "She changed the story depending on who asked," he murmured. It wasn't just one lie anymore. It was dozens of carefully adjusted lies designed so nobody ever compared notes. Friends believed I wasn't interested in birthdays. Store employees believed Dad bought poor anniversary gifts. I believed he forgot me. Dad believed I was angry. Every version kept us separated while making Linda appear helpful in the middle. Looking back, I realized manipulation rarely survives because it's clever. It survives because each person only sees one small piece of it. That afternoon, Dad asked if I wanted to visit the department store where he had purchased the watch for my 16th birthday. "Maybe they won't remember anything," he admitted as we drove across town. "But if we're going to understand this, I think we should start where it began." The store had been renovated several times over the years, Yet the jewelry department still occupied the same corner near the front entrance. A gray-haired gentleman arranging display cases looked up as we approached. His name tag read Walter. Dad hesitated before explaining why we had come. Walter listened quietly without interrupting. When Dad finished, the older man studied him for several seconds. Then his eyes widened. "I remember you." Dad blinked. Walter nodded slowly. "Soon have again. You were the father. You." Stopwatch, who spent almost 2 hours choosing one birthday watch because your daughter said purple was her favorite color. Walter stood quietly behind the jewelry counter for a moment, as though deciding how much he should say. The afternoon store traffic continued around us. Customers browsing display cases, completely unaware that a conversation about a 16-year-old birthday gift was unfolding beside them nearly 15 years later. Finally, Walter folded his reading glasses and rested both hands on the glass counter. "I don't remember every customer," he admitted, "but I remember fathers shopping alone for teenage daughters. They usually looked terrified." A small smile crossed Dad's face despite everything that had happened. "That sounds about right," Walter chuckled softly. "You asked me at least 6 times whether the purple velvet box looked too childish. You wanted everything to be perfect because you said your daughter had been through enough already." I felt my throat tighten. That wasn't the sort of detail someone invents years later. It was the kind of memory retail workers only keep because a customer genuinely stood out. Walter walked toward an old filing cabinet behind the repair counter before returning with a thick leather appointment book. "Back then, we still kept handwritten service records for engraved jewelry," he explained while turning yellowed pages with surprising confidence. "Most of those files have been digitized, but I held on to this one." A few moments later, his finger stopped halfway down a page. He turned the book toward us. There, in faded blue ink, was Dad's name beside a simple instruction: engrave. "No matter how grown up you become, you'll always be my little girl. Love, Dad." My eyes immediately filled with tears. I had never owned that watch. I had never even known those words existed. Yet someone had carefully chosen them, paid to have them engraved, and imagined me reading them on my 16th birthday. Dad quietly covered his mouth with one hand before whispering, "I remember writing that." Walter hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else." He glanced toward the empty customer service desk to make sure no one needed assistance. "A woman came back less than a week later with the watch." Dad already knew that part. The corporate records had confirmed the return. But Walter continued before either of us interrupted. "She told me your daughter hated purple and wanted cash instead." He looked directly at me. "I remember asking why you weren't with her, because engraved jewelry normally can't be returned." My heart skipped. "Engraved," Walter nodded. "Company policy required manager approval. The engraving made it almost impossible to resell." Dad frowned. "Then why was it accepted?" Walter gave a tired smile. "Because she cried." Neither of us spoke. She told our manager that her husband had accidentally engraved a gift meant for his daughter instead of their anniversary present. She said correcting the mistake would embarrass the entire family. Walter shook his head slowly. "The manager made an exception." Dad stared silently at the engraving record while every piece of the story settled into place. Linda hadn't simply returned the watch. She had knowingly erased a deeply personal message that was never intended for anyone else. Worse still, she had convinced strangers to help her do it. Walter reached beneath the counter once more and carefully placed a photocopy of the original engraving order in front of Dad. Legally, I probably shouldn't still have this, he admitted. But sometimes people keep papers because something about a customer stays with them. He looked at me kindly. Your father was so excited that day. He asked me to wrap the box 3 different times until the bow looked perfect. I couldn't stop crying. For nearly 15 years, I had remembered my 16th birthday as the day Dad forgot me. The truth was almost unbearable. He hadn't forgotten. He had spent an entire afternoon trying to create a memory that someone else quietly destroyed before it ever reached me. The drive home passed almost entirely in silence. Dad kept both hands tightly on the steering wheel, speaking only once as we turned onto a street. I'm done guessing. His voice was calm, but beneath that calm rested a determination I had never heard before. Tonight, Linda answers every question. There was no anger in the way he said it. Somehow that frightened me more than shouting ever could have. Dad had spent 40 years negotiating million-dollar construction contracts. He understood evidence, timelines, and contradictions better than anyone I knew. For the first time since discovering the cardboard box, he wasn't searching for another explanation. He was preparing for the truth. When we walked through the front door, Linda was sitting comfortably in the living room reading a magazine as though it were an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She smiled when she saw us together. "You're home early," she said casually. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he placed the cardboard box gently on the coffee table between them. One by one, he removed the receipts, the return confirmations, my childhood letter, the calendar printouts, and finally, Walter's engraving record. Linda's smile slowly disappeared. Dad looked directly into her eyes. Then he asked just one question. Before I say another word, Messiter, is there anything you want to tell me? Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the engraving order. "K," and her face turned completely pale. Linda didn't panic. That surprised me more than anything else. She looked at the stack of receipts spread across the coffee table, took a slow sip of tea, and carefully folded her magazine closed before speaking. "You've certainly been busy," she said quietly. There was no anger in her voice, no obvious fear, only the calm tone of someone who had spent years preparing for difficult conversations. Dad remained standing while I sat silently beside the fireplace, unable to take my eyes off her. Finally, he slid the engraved watch order toward her. "I'm asking one last time," he said. "Did you return Megan's birthday gifts?" Linda looked down at the paper, closed her eyes briefly, and answered with a single word. "Yes." The honesty caught both of us off guard. After days of uncovering hidden evidence, I expected denial, excuses, or accusations. Matter, it almost immediately. But before either of us could speak, she quietly added, "Not because I hated her." The room fell completely silent. Dad frowned. "Then explain it." Linda rested both hands together in her lap, staring at the floor rather than at either of us. "When your mother died," she began, looking toward me for the first time, "you were still living inside a world where every birthday belonged to her." My chest tightened immediately. I hadn't expected my mother to become part of the conversation. Linda continued carefully, choosing each word as though she understood there was no taking them back once spoken. "The first birthday after I married your father, He spent nearly 3 weeks planning your present. Every evening, he talked about what your mother would have bought you. Every decision became, Susan would have liked this, or Susan always wrapped gifts this way. She looked toward Dad with visible sadness. I wasn't your wife. I was competing with a memory that never made mistakes. Dad stared at her in disbelief. So you returned Megan's gifts. Linda nodded once, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. The first time, yes. Her voice became noticeably quieter. I told myself it was only once. She explained that she had convinced herself my father wasn't really buying gifts for me. In her mind, he was trying to recreate the birthdays my mother used to organize, desperately clinging to a family life that no longer existed. Every beautifully wrapped present became another reminder that she would never measure up to the woman Dad had loved first. It wasn't about the bicycle, she whispered, or the telescope, or the watch. Every package felt like proof that no matter what I did, I would always be standing in someone else's place. Listening to her, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not sympathy exactly, but the uncomfortable realization that pain can make ordinary people justify extraordinary cruelty. Dad slowly sat down across from her. Linda, he said quietly, do you have any idea what those birthdays were for me? She looked up but didn't answer. Every gift was my way of telling Megan I was still here after losing her mother. I was terrified she'd think I loved work more than I loved her. His voice cracked for the first time since we found the receipts. And every year, somehow, she drifted a little farther away. He turned toward me, his expression filled with regret. I thought you stopped wanting me around. Hearing those words hurt more than discovering the missing gifts. For 20 years, I believed my father slowly forgot about me. At the exact same time, he believed I was quietly pushing him away. Neither of us had chosen that distance. Someone else had been carefully feeding different stories to both sides until they became impossible to question. Linda covered her face with both hands. I know what I did, she whispered. I've known for years. Dad looked at her steadily. Then why didn't you stop? That question hung in the room for several seconds before she finally answered. Because every year it became harder to tell the truth than the year before. She admitted that after the first returned gift, she panicked whenever another birthday approached. If she suddenly allowed a present to reach me, Dad would immediately ask why previous birthdays had been different. So she invented another excuse, then another. Eventually, she began telling me Dad forgot, while telling Dad I no longer cared. One lie demanded another, until they became the foundation of our family. After enough years, she said quietly, I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was protecting the lie. Her honesty didn't erase what had happened, but it explained something I had struggled to understand. The manipulation hadn't continued because it remained necessary. It continued because admitting the truth became more frightening than maintaining the illusion. Dad leaned forward slowly and looked directly at Linda. Did you keep the money? It was the first question that carried even the slightest edge of anger. Linda immediately shook her head. No, photographers. She stood without another word and walked upstairs. A minute later, she returned carrying a weathered metal cash box that looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. She placed it gently on the coffee table before sliding it toward Dad. Inside were bank deposit slips, old envelopes, and a savings passbook with a balance that had barely changed in more than a decade. Every refund from the returned gifts had been deposited into the same account. The money had never been spent. Interest had accumulated slowly over the years until the total reached just over $18,000. Dad looked at the passbook, then back at Linda. Why? She swallowed hard. Because every time I thought about using it, I couldn't. She lowered her eyes. It never felt like my money. I expected Dad to raise his voice. I expected him to demand answers that would somehow balance 20 lost birthdays against a stack of receipts and a neglected savings account. Instead, he did something far quieter. He picked up the passbook, closed the metal cash box, and gently pushed it back toward Linda. The money isn't what you stole, he said. You stole years. No one moved. No one argued. The sentence settled over the room with a weight no amount of shouting could have matched. Linda broke into tears almost immediately because, for the first time, someone had finally named the thing that could never be returned. Then Dad reached into the cardboard box one last time. At the very bottom, the prox beneath every receipt, remember them, was a small white envelope. It wasn't addressed to me, John me. It wasn't addressed to Linda. Spoke across the front of Enchen in Dad's own handwriting were 3 words. Des. Open if found. For several seconds, none of us reached for the envelope. It was smaller than the others, made from thick, cream-colored paper that had yellowed with age, and the words, "Open if found," were written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Dad frowned as he turned it over in his hands. I don't remember writing this, he admitted quietly. The flap had never been sealed. It looked as though someone had folded the letter inside, tucked it into the envelope, and forgotten it existed. Linda stared at it with visible confusion. I've never seen that before. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I believed her without hesitation. Whatever was inside that envelope hadn't been part of anyone's plan. It was something my father himself had hidden years earlier, long before he knew the truth would someday unravel. Dad slowly unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but it looked rushed, almost frantic. Across the top, he had written a date from 18 years earlier, only 2 days after my 12th birthday. He read the first few lines silently before stopping. His face lost all color. What is it? I asked softly. Instead of answering immediately, he handed me the letter. My eyes moved across the page. If I ever find this note again, it means I was right to trust my instincts. The sentence made no sense at first. Mac, then I kept reading. Donna, something isn't right. Megan says I never remember her birthdays. Linda says Megan doesn't want anything from me anymore. Neither version matches what I see in either of their eyes. If I'm wrong, I'll destroy this letter tomorrow. If I'm right, someday I may need to remember that I noticed before I understood. I looked up at Dad in complete disbelief. Dad, you knew. He slowly shook his head. Vedami. No. I suspected. The room became painfully quiet. Dad sat back in his chair, staring into the distance as memories he hadn't visited in decades slowly returned. I remember writing that, he whispered. Just barely. He explained that after my 12th birthday, something about the evening had felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Linda insisted I had locked myself in my room because I was angry with him, yet when he knocked on my bedroom door, he distinctly remembered hearing quiet crying instead of shouting. He almost opened the door anyway, but Linda stopped him, insisting I needed time alone and would only become more upset if he forced the conversation. The feeling stayed with him all night. Before leaving for work the next morning, he scribbled the letter to himself, hoping to revisit the strange uneasiness after his business trip. Then the project in Denver turned into 6 weeks, he said sadly. When I came home, life just kept moving. The note disappeared into the storage box along with old receipts, forgotten paperwork, and memories buried beneath the urgency of everyday life. I failed you, Dad said quietly, looking directly at me. I immediately shook my head, but he continued before I could interrupt. Not because I forgot birthdays. Because I ignored the voice telling me something wasn't right. His words weren't defensive. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were simply honest. A parent doesn't always have the right answers, he said. But they should never stop asking the right questions. Hearing that hurt because it was true. Linda had manipulated us, but there had also been moments when both of us accepted explanations simply because confronting them felt too exhausting. Families rarely fall apart overnight. They drift apart one unquestioned assumption at a time. Linda finally spoke after several minutes of silence. Richard? Her voice was barely audible. You did ask questions. We both looked toward her. More than once. Tears rolled slowly down her face as she spoke. I remember every conversation because I was terrified each time you got too close to the truth. She admitted there had been nights when Dad insisted on speaking to me directly after birthdays, only for Linda to convince him I was asleep or still upset. Other times, she told me Dad had already left for work early because he didn't want another argument. You kept trying, she whispered. I just kept standing between you. She wasn't asking us to excuse her actions. She was simply refusing, for the first time, to let Dad carry blame that belonged to her. Oddly enough, that honesty made the room feel lighter than it had since the investigation began. A week later, Dad called and asked if I would spend Saturday with him. No investigations, he promised with a tired smile. No more receipts, no more questions. When I arrived at his house that morning, the dining room table was covered with 12 neatly wrapped presents. Each package had a small handwritten tag displaying one birthday I had missed, beginning with my 10th and ending with my 21st. My breath caught instantly. Dad? He smiled nervously, looking almost embarrassed. I know I can't give a 10-year-old a bicycle anymore. We both laughed softly through our tears. And I'm pretty sure a 30-year-old doesn't need a beginner's telescope. He pointed toward the stack of gifts. But I found the closest versions I could. Beside every package rested the original handwritten gift note he had saved inside the cardboard box. Some were faded. Others still looked almost new. Every one of them finally reached the person for whom it had been written. We spent the entire afternoon opening 12 birthdays that had waited nearly 20 years to happen. Some gifts made us laugh because life had changed so much. Others left us speechless. The journal he chose for my college years became the notebook I now use every day with young speech therapy patients. The replacement telescope ended up in Sophie's bedroom because she immediately decided she wanted to learn every constellation Grandpa had once planned to show me. The engraved watch took the longest to replace. Walter, the jeweler, refused to charge Dad for the new engraving after hearing the full story. When I opened the velvet box and read the words inside, "No matter how grown up you become, you'll always be my little girl," I finally cried the tears 16-year-old Megan had never been given the chance to cry. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the backyard fence, Dad looked at the empty wrapping paper scattered across the living room floor. Then he smiled. "Jemmy, I think we finally celebrated your birthdays." 3 months passed before our family gathered in the same house again. This time, it wasn't for a birthday, a holiday, or an uncomfortable dinner where everyone carefully avoided difficult conversations. Sophie was graduating from first grade, and she had insisted on inviting everyone in the family, including Grandpa Richard and Linda. When Ethan asked whether I felt ready for that, I surprised myself by answering yes without hesitation. Readiness, I had learned, isn't the absence of painful memories. It's the willingness to stop letting those memories make every decision for your future. Linda and I hadn't become close. Some wounds require honesty, forgiveness, and time, but they don't always return people to who they were before. Still, she had written me 3 letters over the previous months, none asking for forgiveness, none defending her actions. Each simply acknowledged another birthday she had taken away and another memory she wished she could return. I never knew exactly how to answer those letters, but I read every one of them. Sometimes accountability doesn't need a reply. It simply needs to exist. Dad, on the other hand, quietly began rebuilding our relationship the only way he knew how, through consistency instead of grand gestures. Every Wednesday evening, he stopped by after work to help Sophie with whatever school project she happened to be working on that week. Some evenings they built cardboard castles. Other weeks they planted flowers in the backyard or assembled bird feeders from old scrap wood. He never announced those visits or posted photographs online. They simply became part of our family's routine. One afternoon, I overheard Sophie telling a classmate, "My grandpa never misses Wednesdays." The sentence caught me completely off guard because it reminded me of something I'd spent most of my childhood wishing I could say. Dad heard it too. He looked at me across the kitchen without speaking, and I could see tears gathering in his eyes. We both understood that he wasn't changing the past. He was making sure another little girl would never have to question whether she mattered. The district's literacy program also continued growing beyond anything I expected. Volunteers doubled within 6 months, and schools that once struggled to recruit reading mentors suddenly had waiting lists. During one community recognition ceremony, the superintendent asked me what inspired me to spend so much time helping children feel seen and heard. I paused before answering because, until that moment, I hadn't fully connected the pieces myself. When children don't understand why something painful happens, I said, they usually blame themselves. The right adult can change that story before it becomes part of who they believe they are. The audience applauded politely, but I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about 12 birthdays, a cardboard box full of receipts, and a little girl who spent years believing she simply wasn't memorable enough for her father to remember. If Dad and I hadn't uncovered the truth together, that story might have stayed with me forever. Late that summer, Walter from the jewelry store called unexpectedly. "I have something that belongs to you," he said. Curious, Dad and I drove over the following weekend. Walter disappeared into the back office before returning with a small velvet pouch. "When your original watch was returned," he explained, Our engraver removed the movement because the case couldn't be resold. We usually melted pieces like that down for scrap, but one of our craftsmen kept it because he felt bad about the situation. He carefully opened the pouch. Inside lay the original silver watch casing, slightly worn but still beautiful. The engraving remained untouched. No matter how grown up you become, you'll always be my little girl. Love, Dad. Dad. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Dad reached out carefully, running his thumb across the engraved words as though he were touching a memory instead of metal. Walter smiled gently. I figured it finally found the right owner. I fastened the empty watch case onto a chain and have worn it as a necklace ever since. It no longer tells time, but somehow it reminds me of everything time almost stole. Nearly a year after my 30th birthday, Dad invited the entire family to dinner once again. This time, before anyone sat down, he carried a framed photograph into the dining room and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. It wasn't an expensive family portrait or a professionally staged picture. It was a simple photograph Walter had secretly taken the day Dad bought the replacement watch. In the picture, Dad and I were laughing together over the jewelry counter, while Sophie stood between us holding the purple velvet box with both hands. Across the bottom of the frame, Dad had added a small brass plaque that read, "Some gifts arrive late. They're still gifts." No one commented on the plaque during dinner, but I noticed Linda quietly reading it twice before taking her seat. After dessert, she walked over to me while everyone else cleared the table. I don't expect us to ever forget what happened, she said softly. I just hope that someday, when Sophie remembers me, she remembers the woman I became afterward, instead of the woman I was. I looked toward the backyard where Dad was teaching Sophie how to skip stones across the pond. Then I looked back at Linda. That's up to you, I answered gently. She nodded. I know. It wasn't a perfect ending. Real families rarely get those, but it was an honest one. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, I hope you'll remember something far more important than the mystery of the missing birthday gifts. Children don't build their understanding of love from grand vacations or expensive presents. They build it from patterns, from who calls, who shows up, who keeps their promises. And when those patterns are broken, children almost never assume the adults made mistakes. They assume they weren't worth remembering. That quiet belief can follow someone for decades unless the truth finds them first. I spent 20 years believing my father forgot 12 birthdays. He spent 20 years believing his daughter no longer wanted him in her life. The tragedy wasn't that one of us stopped loving the other. The tragedy was that we allowed someone else's version of the story to replace our own. The greatest revenge I ever received wasn't watching Linda admit what she had done. It wasn't discovering the receipts or proving that I had been right all along. It was something much quieter than that. It was watching my father become the grandfather who never missed a Wednesday. It was seeing my daughter grow up, never questioning whether she was loved. And it was finally understanding that the most valuable gifts in life aren't always the ones wrapped in paper. Sometimes they're the conversations that arrive years too late, but still in time to change everything that comes after.